Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we have our returning guest. I think you're almost certainly the most popular guest on the show, and the one who I think this is maybe our sixth or seventh podcast together, Alon Burstein, who has now moved to Boston and Tufts, hence the sunset in the background. Alon, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Always good to be here. Now from afar.
Exactly. So there are obviously a lot of interesting current events in Israel, but we specifically spoke before this, and we are not going to hit on all the current events that are probably relevant to listeners following, Israel and Iran, and who knows what'll even be the status quo by the time we publish it. I wanted to do something a little bit more quote unquote timeless and talk about an issue that keeps on coming up anytime there's any sort of inflammation in the region, whether through between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and the wider Middle East. And that's the question of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, this is relevant just to paint the background, then you can add whatever, and then really we'll try to give a more historical approach and then, go to modern day. Right now, there is sort of a new set of condemnations really coming from every which direction, which is part of the interesting, I think, angle of this, of religious Zionist MKs in the Knesset that decided on Tisha B'Av, which is one of the most solemn and also one of the most Jerusalem-centric, I'll say, Jewish holidays on the calendar, that actually decided to go up to the Temple Mount and break this, what is it now, 57-year ban, both from the Jordan Waqf and from the Israeli government on Jews praying in the Temple Mount. And this was seen as an act of both religiosity, but probably more political protest. I don't know if you have anything to add about the current events, but we'll sort of use this as a jumping off point.
So the only thing I'll add is the symbolic elements that were within this, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the symbolism of Temple Mount, or as it's known in the Muslim world, Haram al-Sharif. But the symbolism especially was that who went to Temple Mount was the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, an extremely well-known hawkish figure. This is not just a random hawkish figure. This is someone who the entire Arab and probably Muslim world knows about. And also the symbolism of the pictures that came out there were of Jews that were bowing down to the floor, which is also done extremely symbolically. This is not part of Jewish faith. This is not how you pray in Judaism. This is explicitly how you pray in Islam. This was not about, at least that picture, was not a moment of prayer. It was a moment of sending a message to the Islamic world. Look, prayer is being done the way you understand prayer on Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif. So specifically the symbolism of all the ways in which this was done is what really has made this an interesting development.
So we've talked about Ben-Gvir before, I think probably a year and a half,
times.
2 years ago. And so for listeners that are, interested more in that, they can go look in the background. I think the podcast is labeled, Who is Ben-Gvir and Why Should You Care? Or something like that. And this is back when he was still a, relatively newcomer to the Knesset. Obviously, he's been at the forefront of a lot of the most politically fraught and controversial moves and statements that really anybody in the Israeli government has made. Starting at the beginning, the Temple Mount is so much at the intersection of the wider Israeli-Arab conflict, even in a way that I think goes beyond the way a lot of Westerners see the conflict. One of the ways I want to frame this, and then I'd love to hear if you accept this framing or want to push back, is we tend in the West, or at least the way that, say, the UN or the EU or American leaders have classified the conflict, is that this is mostly a political conflict with a little bit of religion inserted in. And the way that I've always seen the conflict is this is basically a 50-50, right? The power of religion and the power of politics. And I don't think there's any better proof than the question of the Temple Mount, right? If this was just a political conflict, right? We both spent time in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount, it's a nice little hill, but politically, there's no reason why that's a more important hill than any of the other hills that surround there. Yet it is always so much at the intersection, not just of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Obviously, we'll talk about the Intifada in a moment and how the Temple Mount was really one of the, powder kegs for that. But really the entire Arab world, many of the at least stated reasons why a lot of other countries around the Middle East get involved is because of the Temple Mount. So I wanted to throw that to you in terms of the framing of the conflict.
So I would not argue that the conflict is 50-50. I would say it just depends for which actor. Most actors prior to the 1980s saw the conflict as political. There was one attempt back in 1935. Izzadin al-Qassam tried to frame the conflict as religious. He declared a jihad against Zionism, but other than that, it was purely political. This changed. This changed in the 1960s and 70s from the side of Zionism and Judaism, with really the birth and growth of the modern religious Zionist movement. And then it changed also in the 80s and 90s, and much more accelerated in the 21st century in the Palestinian side and in the Islamic world. Then the conflict became much more religious. The role of Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif, and there's a reason I say both, because actually it's very symbolic to even see not only what is it called by researchers, scholars, journalists, but even in the language that is used by the activists on the ground. I was part of a research project that was looking at the local mobilization of Arab Palestinian citizens in Israel in 2000. And one of the ways we said if a protest was religious or if it was nationalistic was in the nationalistic ones, they were chanting Biroch Bedam Navdiki Palestine, with blood and sweat will liberate Palestine. And the ones that left the mosques were chanting Biroch Bedam Navdiki Al-Aqsa, with blood and sweat will liberate Al-Aqsa. Will liberate the struggle was not about Palestine. It was about the mosque that sits on that mountain. So really, the role of that mountain is a defining characteristic, and what do we call it and how we treat what is the conflict about does say something about, is it more about religion or is it more about politics? I don't think it's 50-50. I don't think it has been 50-50. I think it started much more political, became much more religious. Maybe now it's 50-50 on both sides, but I don't think it was all along. I think it's swung like a pendulum from side to side.
Got it. No, it's a really interesting classification. So starting at the beginning here for listeners that might have seen the phrase Temple Mount, but are really starting with, zero background, just to sort of fly through some of the history, and you can add in your commentary as we go. The Temple Mount obviously is called such in Hebrew Har HaBayit because that is the mountain that the temple stood. A very long time ago, I recall a lengthy debate between me and you about whether or not King David and King Solomon were historical figures or whether or not they were sort of mythical figures made up by the Tanakh, right? We won't rehash that debate.
We can leave it though for listeners to decide to guess who between the academic and the rabbi
yes.
who was saying what.
Exactly. Listeners can leave in the comments, what their feelings on that. But all scholars agree that at some point, 9th, 8th, 7th century, I'm talking about the BCEs, which is why I'm counting down, there was a first temple in Jerusalem that was then subsequently destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in the year 586 BCE. Subsequently, when the Persian Empire took over, King Cyrus famously allowed all exilees of the Babylonian Empire back to their ancient homelands. In the Jewish case, this meant the land of Israel and Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, just a historical tangent, most Jews actually did not want to go back to Israel because life in Babylonia was pretty great. But
this is how we ended up with the Babylonian Talmud versus the Jerusalem. I mean, again, like situating
exactly. And it's actually funny, and I can never do a podcast with you without going on interesting tangents. It's funny because whenever I'm studying this with students and we read the passages in the end of the Tanakh where most Jews didn't want to go back, people are shocked. And then I say, hey, you do realize you're living in Irvine and not Jerusalem. And they're like, oh, yeah. So there is interesting historic
so you'll
parallels.
start the Irvine Talmud soon enough.
Exactly. There we go. And the second temple stood from about, the year 515. It's unclear exactly when it was built until the Roman Empire destroyed it in the year 70 CE. So by any accounts, there was a Jewish temple on that mountain for about 900 years. Once the temple was destroyed, it was burned down by the Roman Empire. Only one of the outside walls of the mountain remained standing. That is, familiar to probably all of our listeners as the Western Wall or the Kotel, which has sort of taken on the symbolism in Judaism as the quote unquote holiest site of Judaism. But really, it's only the holiest site because that is in some way the only last vestige of the temple, which is actually the Temple Mount. And so the Temple Mount in Jewish history has really been seen as a symbol of Jerusalem and the temple and, what was lost thousands of years ago. Just to finish off the Jewish side, and then I'll throw it to you to talk about the significance in the Islamic world. Interestingly enough, the rabbis thousands of years ago actually issued a set of laws about how Jews should relate to this Temple Mount, because one of the things that listeners may or may not be aware of is the temple in Jerusalem was considered to be an extremely holy place, and holiness in this case was defined as which type of people are actually allowed in which areas. And so, you can read endless discussions in, early rabbinic, law in the Talmud about, there are some areas where only Jews are allowed and others only male Jews and others only people who are Levites and then others only people who are priests and then the high priest. And the problem arose for the rabbis of the Talmud that nobody really knows where any of these areas are. So you get sort of endless debate trying to reconstruct this temple from, you know, the metrics given in the Hebrew Bible as to where exactly this stood. But most legal scholars in Jewish history have actually decreed that Jews best not go up to the Temple Mount for fear of accidentally stepping into a holy place. So we'll get back
Best
to that
not,
in a
are
minute.
forbidden to.
Yeah.
It's not seen as an advisory best not. I'll
Yes,
correct
yes,
on
yes,
that.
absolutely forbidden. In the most extreme case, actually excommunicating anybody who did it, because again, it's seen as a breach of holiness of the highest kind. And so, you know, this also has fascinating interplay in Israel, but that is certainly the significance for the Jewish side. I can try to unpack a little bit of the Islamic side, but I'll give it to you and see if there's anything
No,
that's worth adding.
I'm not going to take it so much towards the, you know, this is always the difference between us. I'm not going to take it so much towards the theological from the Islamic side, and more to take us through a little bit and history from then. Because what happened after the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 is that there was another Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire in the year 132 to 135. After that, the Romans got pissed with the Jewish population in what was then renamed the land of Palestine. And as a result, Jews were actually forbidden from entering Jerusalem. And not only that, the Romans built a legion and the Romans established a legion and put it specifically on Temple Mount and built in it a pagan temple in order to rename the city Ilia Capitolina, in order to show this is no longer the holy site of Judaism. Now, again, fast forwarding down in the 7th century, 8th century, there is the Arab conquest, and part of the Arab conquest is building a lot of theological stories about the journeys of Muhammad, and one of the most important ones and iconic ones after he went from Mecca and the Hijrah to Medina is he traveled to the Far Mosque. The Far Mosque, where was it? Well, again, there were a lot of religious debates within Islam, but it was decreed that it was the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or what would become the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And for Jerusalem, symbolically, where you have religious sites is the old city of Jerusalem, right? There's a reason it's not on the Mount of Olives or on some other place in Jerusalem. You come to Jerusalem, everyone knows where the holy sites are. Then it was the Judaism, then it was the Christianity right next to that. So it makes perfect sense. And that's looking at it from a historical perspective, that Islam also saw in Temple Mount, or what would become Haram al-Sharif, which means the holy site, the site of where Muhammad was. So that became the third holiest site in Islam. Now, again, I'm not come at things from the academic point of view, so I'm not going to get into the theology of the meaning, how accurate that is or not is. From my perspective, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the political developments that then happened. Jerusalem became a focal point. It became a symbolic point. It became one of the points where there was also a meeting between the Islamic world and the Christian world. Yes, Islam spread throughout Africa, and yes, of course, it spread up to Turkey, but the farthest point you could come by sea, right, this is before the Suez Canal, farthest point you come by sea from the Christian world to enter into the Muslim world was what was then Palestine, and then that would mean that Jerusalem was a very strategic site. That is the reason also the Crusaders set their sights on Jerusalem. It was also seen because of its religiosity, but also very symbolically. That is the reason that Salah ad-Din liberated Jerusalem from the Muslim point of view. Jerusalem became extremely symbolic to all religions over the years, even though in Judaism, right, as you said, it was just a wall that actually Jews are forbidden to go up into the mountain. In Islam, it's the third holiest point in Islam. And in Christianity, yes, it is the site of Jesus and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but really the seat of Christianity had become then Rome and the Vatican. So to no one, it was really like seen as something that's tangibly the most important point, but it became politically the focal point of everyone. Fast forwarding 1,000+ years, what ends up happening is after Israel is established, the Zionists that then became the Israeli Defense Force tried in the war of 1948 to burst into Jerusalem and take over the old city from Jordan. Again, very complex history of what happened in the actual war. I'm butchering history here, but ostensibly, but when the ceasefire lines are drawn, the famous green line that divides up the land that would become Israel from Jordan and Egypt, the old city of Jerusalem is exactly on the green line. It's exactly on the ceasefire line, and it stays in Jordanian hands. It stays in Jordanian hands. For all intents and purposes, most Jews are kicked out of that area at that time. Jordan renames this area the West Bank. That is where the name the West Bank comes from, because Jordan controls the East Bank, and this was the West Bank of the Jordan River, and it was controlled by Jordan until 1967. In 1967, right, that's the Six-Day War, June War, Israel takes over East Jerusalem. This is where things are sped up to what is the status quo and why it's so complex in our modern time. Do you want to interject here?
Yeah.
Before
Well,
keep on
just I mean,
going down the
sprinkle again.
history?
Yeah. I mean, I think 1967 is where we'll start our anchor for a second. Just some other things to add into. One just a interesting side historic point is there were constantly plots, and there were a lot of plots post 67, but even a couple before by people who wanted to aggravate the area to actually try to blow up various versions of the Temple Mount, that which also I believe at least Al-Aqsa, the mosque there, went through a number of renovations. I think Jordan had a major renovation in the 1950s and everything like that. One of the things that you hear from a lot of Israelis on the right, and so I wanted to just get this out there, is, and I really don't like this argument for a variety of reasons that I'm also happy to get into, but is that, well, before 1967, the Temple Mount was basically just a bunch of rubble, and clearly nobody cared about it throughout the Arab world, and it was only once the Zionists / the Jews / Israel conquered it, then it became this place of significance. I'm curious, just from a historic political perspective, I mean, how much weight do you give that argument?
Not a lot. In the Islamic world, the Al-Aqsa always had a lot of significance. There was a lot of competition between the different Muslim leaders, the Ottomans, the Hashemites, the Saudis. There's a lot of competition over who is going to be the one who's the custodian. Hussein, who was the Sharif of Mecca back in the 1920s, was adamant that he was going to be responsible as the person responsible for Islam's holy sites, not just for Mecca and Medina, but also for Jerusalem, because by definition, those are the holy sites. It is true that the idea that all Muslims should be obligated to the liberation of Al-Aqsa as a jihad, as a holy cause, really took off, like I said, almost in the late 20th century, more when the conflict became more religious. And again, most Muslims don't ascribe to that, just like most Jews don't ascribe to any sort of liberation. But I'm saying the rhetoric about that, about the significance of that, may have only taken on a bigger tone then as part of some sort of religious crusade, but it has been important over the years, and there have been struggles over the years between Muslim leaders among themselves who's going to rule it, and certainly who is going to rule Jerusalem has been a struggle between the Islamic world and the Christian world, which, if we compare it, to some extent, if we adopt this clash of civilizations between the Arab world and the Western world, now that struggle has been for thousands of years. Al-Aqsa has always been a focal point that the Islamic world has struggled for.
Got it. Yeah, that makes total sense. And I mean, on my side, and I think this interestingly goes to the difference between how we like to describe things. To me, it's just theologically insensitive, meaning I think, whatever one thinks about the politics of the Temple Mount, you at least have to grant that somebody telling you that a place is holy to them, right? You have to grant that it is holy to them. I mean, so to me, it's always just been a very frustrating argument of, well, how do you know that, right? There was actually a really good book by Yossi Klein Halevi. He's the author of why am I
Memoirs
forgetting
of
the name?
Extremist.
Yeah, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, but then also he wrote my favorite book about 1967, like Dreamers. Highly recommend the book. But he wrote another book. I'm forgetting what it's called, but he went through, different Palestinian populations, talking to them about religion. And it's a very moving book because he sort of went from being a very right-wing Jewish settler, sort of every stereotype. He was a Kahanist, which, again, if listeners are unfamiliar with that term, see our podcast on Ben Gvir. So very much, that mindset, to realizing, okay, there's actually like a real set of people on the other side with genuine beliefs, both religious and political, that you can disagree with them, but they're not just these, Ottomans that are, all.
It's not just rhetoric. That's the thing. I teach classes on religious terrorism, and everyone says, "Well, they just use that as rhetoric." And I'm like, no, people are true believers. People are true believers on all sides. And like you said, like if they say they believe this, I tend to believe them. What you're willing to do for your belief is something we can argue about. But I tend to believe people when they say I truly believe in this. But anyway, let's get back to our history or our focus.
Okay, so 1967, Israel takes over Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. What happens then?
So then, very interesting things happen that, as most things in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, most things were just a patchwork of just solve the problem now and seen as temporary, and they become permanent. What ends up happening is the chief rabbi of the IDF, then Rabbi Shlomo Goren, is put in charge of Temple Mount. He's put in charge of Temple Mount as part of the recognition within the idea of this is a holy site in Judaism, and Israel as a Jewish state is just taking it over. Okay, the chief rabbi of the IDF is put in charge. He then was given no orders. He was given no orders of what's going to happen there. And what he started doing is actually forming organizations of Jewish officers to come and pray, to come and recreate the Jewish holy site. In one of his memoirs, he actually writes that when he was put in charge of it, right after it was taken over, the general in charge of the invasion said, just guard this territory. He said that he was certain that they were going to bring bombs in order to come and blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Like, as far as he was concerned, this is now being taken over by Israel. Therefore, it's going to be the recreation of the Jewish temple, Jewish life, and he started organizing daily prayers, all kinds of things that not only, as you said, are contradictory to a lot of Jewish theology, but also were not sanctioned by the government and were starting to be very problematic as ceasefire was drawn up, as the Israel then had to contend internationally, diplomatically. Okay, so what are you doing? It started to look very bad. And interestingly, where things sort of came to the fold, wouldn't you know, the ninth day of Av. The ninth day of Av in 1967, Shlomo Goren tries to organize a big mass rally, and the Minister of Defense at that time, Moshe Dayan, comes and says no. He cancels that, and at that moment, he orders that no more Jewish prayer is allowed on Temple Mount. Again, this was a reaction to a momentary thing that happened. Then a very interesting thing starts to develop. Jordan still claimed the West Bank until 1988. Jordan still said the West Bank belongs to it. And one of the things that it did is it still paid salaries to bureaucrats within the West Bank. And one of the main things that main organizations paid salary to was the Waqf. The Waqf is the Islamic sort of like holy guard of Temple Mount that administers the mosque, that administers the areas of Haram al-Sharif. Jordan was still paying their salary. Israel then did a very strategic thing in order to keep the peace and started negotiating with the Waqf. So to say, okay, you know what? We see that just the chief rabbi coming and steamrolling over what's happening here is going to inflame the Muslim world. We're not interested. What are we going to do? How are we going to work this out? And they came up with a series of agreements, some of them formalized in writing, some of them orally, that basically organize and lay down the law of what's going to be in Temple Mount. The first of those being the Israeli police and Jerusalem municipality have overarching control over security. You're not allowed to have other security, other armed guards, or anything else. The area is under official Israeli jurisdiction. At the same time, administering Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif, what happens in the day-to-day life is left up to the Waqf. It was also decided that Jews will be allowed to visit Temple Mount. However, they will not be allowed to pray on Temple Mount. This was sort of mutually beneficial in the sense that in Israel, there was concern of radicals on the one hand. There was also concern from the religious parties that, as you said, this was forbidden in Judaism, so it works for the Jewish population. And as far as the Muslim population was concerned, the Waqf, this works too, because this area is seen as a mosque. Only Muslims are allowed to pray there. That largely was maintained. Was largely maintained from 1967 right up until the 1990s. Again, obviously there were different hiccups along the way. There were different violent events in the 1980s. There was a Jewish underground that was a Jewish terror organization that had organized a plot to blow up Al-Aqsa Mosque. They had the plans, they had the bombs. The reason that they did not carry out their plot, by the way, is because they could not find a rabbi who would religiously sanction them doing that. And that is the only reason why they were held up long enough until the Shabak actually uncovered their activity. All this continues until the 1990s. In the 1990s, things start to change, largely as a result of the budding negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. When all of a sudden there's negotiations, and it starts to become apparent that Israel is talking about a return to the Green Line, that is the divide, the borders of 1967, which mean that Temple Mount, Old City of Jerusalem, would no longer necessarily be in Israeli hands or only in Israeli hands. The topic almost departs on the Jewish side, almost like departs from politics and takes on a much more, departs from religion, from is it religiously sanctioned to go up to the mountain or not, and becomes much more political. All of a sudden, you have rabbis from within religious Zionism who start sanctioning that actually Jews are allowed to go up and pray on Temple Mount. Jews should go out and pray on Temple Mount. And from this moment, it becomes a much more hot topic. From this moment, you have Jews smuggling onto Temple Mount and secretly praying. The Waqf then attacking them or publicizing this, lodging complaints. The police then breaking in occasionally to stop riots. We'll get to what happened in 2000. But throughout the 1990s, this starts to escalate and becomes very symbolic. It was not the same political bone of contention as it was before. Someone asked me once, how do I explain the symbolism of this? And I said, actually, even departing from religion, it's almost as symbolic as the way most of our listeners probably have heard of the famous U.S. embassy in Israel. It was in Tel Aviv. Donald Trump famously moved it to Jerusalem, which was seen as a major victory for Israel and a major loss to the Palestinians. And I often ask people, why? How is your life any better? How does this benefit Israel? Because it became symbolic. It doesn't matter if that does benefit Israel or harms Palestinians. It became symbolic that by moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the United States was doing something to favor Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Similarly, Temple Mount became a political clash, whereas before it was much more of a religious clash. It took on this political tone that now is so symbolic that anyone who even raises a flag on Temple Mount, it's a Palestinian flag, a Hamas flag, an Israeli flag, a Kahana's flag, all of a sudden becomes something that makes international media. So this happened really only in the 90s.
Got it. Yeah, and it's really interesting. I'm just thinking of the role of symbols. I mean, I was talking, earlier, and we were talking about ceasefire resolution, say in city council meetings. And, my last podcast was with current Irvine council member Tammy Kim, and we were just talking, on the podcast of why is it so important? I mean, as much as I love Irvine and, as a past Irvine resident, you probably love it also, right?
Of course.
What is, who cares to some extent if Irvine symbolically has a ceasefire resolution or back and forth? In a lot of ways, the Temple Mount is like that. Just to fill in a little bit of the religious background, because I can imagine a lot of listeners thinking, wait, what happened with that religious ban going up to the Temple Mount? Because this is actually a fascinating departure point just to get into the nitty gritty of, internal Israeli politics between the religious Zionists and, religious non-Zionists or the ultra-Orthodox / Haredim. For listeners who want the really technical answer, hopefully we don't have too many people shutting off the podcast, the podcast now.
I'll make him keep it short.
Yes, the nerdy Talmudist in me, just has to say it, right? The debate really hinged on where the actual temple was. And so many of the ultra-Orthodox rabbis, and this is to me, this is interesting because it's representative of a lot of the difference between religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox. Again, just a reminder, religious Zionists viewing the state as a mechanism, as a means to a religious end, the ultra-Orthodox community viewing the state as sort of irrelevant or actually detrimental to a religious end. Just to paint that for listeners, Shlomo Goren was convinced that with, both current technology and using the Bible and rabbinic literature, he actually was able to figure out exactly where the temple was, thereby allowing people to come up. So it's not that in his mind, the prohibition on Jews ascending the Temple Mount was moot or ended. Still to this day, and I've actually, gone up to the Temple Mount a couple of times over the course of my life. And if you do it with a, religious Zionist group, you actually, one, you go to the mikveh first. Two, you actually are going up with a rabbi / a guide who's saying, you can walk on this path, but don't cross this stone. And, it's a very, interesting and strange, I don't know, set of geographical holiness. So that was a fascinating debate there. Okay, getting into Oslo, just to summarize, and you can tell me if I'm adding too much into what you're saying. When this turned into political, specifically in a scenario that there was a two-state solution, that any Israeli politician were potentially willing to divide up Jerusalem, right? This also came up again in 2008. The sort of right-wing Israeli world and the religious Zionist world basically mobilized and threw whatever they could against it. And the Temple Mount grew, even for itself, a level of symbolism, I would say, for the Jewish world, even than it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Is that sort of a good just to before?
Yeah, like it took on, right, for extremists and hawkish elements on both sides, right? The idea of giving up any claim to any land, right, from the Palestinian side, right, from Hamas's side. The idea of giving up any claim to any part of Palestine, regardless of what it is seen as heresy. From the point of view of hawkish elements of Kahanists or religious Zionists, even on the most extreme side, the idea of giving up any land for a Palestinian state is seen as heresy. But where it became something that is the holiest of holies, pardon the pun, the holiest of holies that you do not touch, that you cannot touch, the Holy Grail was all focused around Temple Mount because this was a symbolic element of what each side could claim is a historic religious anchoring for its basic identity, right? What is Judaism? Is it a nation? Is it a religion? Is it an ethnicity? We've talked about this. I think we even have a podcast about this also. What does it mean to be, Jewish or Zionist? Well, the one of the most biggest anchors that the Jews could have to the land is a religious one that, as you said, relates back to the existence of the temple there. So for secular Jews also, that is symbolic anchoring. In turn, on the Palestinian side, Yasser Arafat long said that he was working to also liberate the sites that are holiest to Islam and Christianity from the hands of the Jews. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan claimed that it was the custodian of Al-Aqsa as the most important place for Muslims, the Islamic world. So in a lot of ways, even though, like, obviously for, like I said, extremists on all sides giving up any part of the land is seen as heresy, this was seen as something that touches on the very identity of the justification for your struggle. If you're willing to give that up, if you're willing to say, actually, I don't need that, then that could call into question your entire identity, your entire claim to the
And this
land,
is
which is
true.
very, very dangerous.
So I don't know if this is pushing back or adding in sort of a wrinkle. You can decide. Israel consciously decided in 1967 to not take full political and security control over it. Meaning there was a time in 1967 where you could run the, counterfactual in terms of the history there. And in the most extreme, right, obviously, completely raise down, any mosques that were on the site and fully make it into a Jewish site, fine.
Right.
Understandably why Israel doesn't want to do that. But the move of then ceding control back to the Waqf, the Jordanese, government that, again, just for listeners' background, 1967, I mean, Jordan was one of the combatant countries against Israel. So this isn't Israel in 2024 turning to Saudi Arabia and saying, okay, you're kind of, half ally, half neutral, half, whatever, you take control of this. This is saying we just finished a war. And, and again, and a couple of years later, obviously, there was another war, 1973, that's, beyond the scope of this. So we are actively hostile towards we are actively hostile towards each other, and still you can take control over this. I mean, what was the goal? I mean, were they just trying to convince other Arab countries that they actually do mean well? Was this trying to throw them a bone? Did they realize this was so fraught that it can just cause, another Middle East flare up, right then in 67?
A combination of all the above, and also, again, like I said before, it was not seen as a long-term plan. Most of these things are done for the moment. It was unclear after 1967 what was going to happen. In a lot of the government debates, there were talks about, okay, after 1967 in Israel, there were a lot of talks. Clearly, the Arab world now understands that they cannot defeat Israel. And there was even like one government meeting that was concluded with, so what's happening is we're waiting for a phone call from the Arab world, or the leaders of the Arab world, to tell us now it's time to make peace. Okay, they waited. They waited for a long time. And but that perception of there's going to now be a status quo change. So we just need something temporary. We don't actually want to flare up the situation. We need something temporarily in order to keep the peace was to large extents the perception of in Israel at that time. It was also very unclear and remains unclear to this day what was going to be the fate of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Right? We know now, looking back, that all the temporary decisions that were made back then, such as imposing martial law, but allowing Israeli population to set up random settlements here and there, which was then seen as a very, very temporary move by the government. Here we are. This became one of the hardest issues to resolve with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Also then, this wasn't seen as how are we going to now figure out a system that works, because it doesn't work, and it broke down in the 90s and continues to break down. What it was seen as, okay, we currently have a situation and we're waiting to see how the dust settles. How can we keep the peace? Okay, there is an Islamic organization that claims that it is running the place. Israel does not actually want religiously and politically to let Jews run the place. Okay, we can agree. You'll run the place, but we'll maintain security. We'll let Jews come up, but we won't let them pray. It seemed to make sense for the moment. And what I would take as a surprise is not so much that it broke down, more that it actually lasted for a good 30 years as some sort of agreement. That I find much more surprising, actually.
Yeah, I mean, implicit in what you're saying, and this is certainly what I think somebody who is more on the Israeli right would say if they popped into this podcast, is when Israel agrees to cede religious control over the Temple Mount, that in some way signifies that it must not be that important, right? If something is the holiest thing possible for you, there's no way you're going to cede back authority to it. And one of the reasons why I believe that, at least on the Israeli religious right, this has become such a focal point is exactly to rebut that question of saying this is not a case of, this is not just, another hill or politically important. This is, for us as religious Zionists, I'm paraphrasing because I do not identify as a religious Zionist, as the great Yeshayahu Leibowitz said, I'm religious and I'm a Zionist, but I'm not a religious Zionist. We can do another podcast on that.
And we will.
But, what religious Zionists would say is, me as a religious Zionist, this is actually representative of the entire reason why I care about this place, far more than, Rehovot or Tel Aviv or anything like that. And so exactly the sort of, inverse of what you just said, I think is the reason why so many people are pushing to this day about the issue.
It's also important to remember, though, that until the mid 1980s, I mean, really early 1980s, but in earnest, 85, 86, the main threats on Israel were of the Arab armies. The wars were not with terror organizations. They were not with people. They were with armies. The military clashes was an Israeli-Arab conflict, not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so also the notion that you could cede control to a local organization wasn't seen as something that would be maybe as complex or as dangerous as it is today, right? To large extents, Israel offered throughout the years to have local Palestinian administration take over different areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. What today Israel is seeing as how could it even be suggested that Israel let Hamas take over the Gaza Strip or even bring in the Palestinian Authority? But to a large extent, that was considered throughout the 70s and 80s and even to some extent the 90s, because it was seen if Israel has overarching security control, then it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal to cede control to like a local organization because you're the overarching control. The threat then, the conflict was between armies. So in that sense, also, it wasn't seen as something that can't be reversed. It just over the years became something that can't be reversed, so much so that any change, minute change even, not to mention bigger changes in the status quo, are enough to flare up the entire region, as we've seen starting in 2000. So I don't know if you want to segue to that.
Yeah. So let's talk about 2000. Just 2 seconds of background from 67 to 2000. As is the case today, it was a law that Jews are not allowed to go up and pray on the Temple Mount, and it was always seen as fraught. Especially, even groups visiting was considered, it was very carefully done, if at all. It's fascinating to talk to people who lived in Jerusalem over those years of, who visited, why. It's much more common, I think, for Jews to visit the Temple Mount today than it was before the year 2000. But what happens in 2000?
So between 1993 and 2000, we have the Oslo peace process. The Oslo peace process was an attempt, negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, to come to some sort of resolution and actually resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the things they did in order to jumpstart that, and this was led by then U.S. President Bill Clinton, one of the things they did is said, we will start small. We'll start small and defer the things that are hardest to resolve to the end. So the sides will build trust, and then they'll come to the end and they'll be able to negotiate final status agreements. What was pushed to the end was the issue of Palestinian refugees, the issue of settlements, what is going to be the fate of Jewish settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the issue of Jerusalem. What's going to be with Jerusalem? It was seen as one of the things you don't touch. What happens throughout the Oslo process is it started between then the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. Rabin is assassinated in 1995. Netanyahu comes to power for the first time in 1996. He's Prime Minister and the process is largely stalled. From 96 to 99, in 1999, Ehud Barak becomes Prime Minister in Israel. Labor comes back to power, and it's seen as though there's going to be a final peace agreement. However, in July of 2000, there's the Camp David meeting in which the process largely gets stuck. The sides cannot agree on what is going to be how they're going to resolve those unresolvable issues. I'll say, sort of in a caveat, that what was proposed for Jerusalem was that the West Bank would be returned to the, or given to the Palestinians, and establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem would be divided between East and West. However, the old city of Jerusalem, which holds, again, Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Holy Sepulchre, would have joint administration. There would be a committee made up of Israel, the United States, Jordan, and the state of Palestine. And they would all share administration of the old city of Jerusalem. That was what was proposed. The deal breaks down. It does not break down in war, but it just breaks down in July of the year 2000. So the end of September 29th, September 30th, Ariel Sharon, who was then the leader of the opposition, and then known as one of the most hawkish figures within Israel, decides to make a very, very public visit to Temple Mount. He makes a very public televised visit to Temple Mount, to Haram al-Sharif, in order to show his presence there, in order to show the presence of who was then the chief objector to the peace process with the Palestinians, the chief objector to the idea of the land of Israel, and his visit as High tried to issue orders to launch, but he couldn't legally do that. And as a result of Ariel Sharon's visits, riots break out. The IDF represses the riots. A day later, the second Intifada is born, and that is the official collapse of the Oslo peace process. So in that sense, Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, again, has huge symbolic impact. Ariel Sharon, by the way, within a year after that, is elected prime minister.
It's always one of those questions that I think historians seem to debate about.
In that sense,
oh, sorry. I think you cut out for a second, but I'll use this as an opportunity to throw in a question. It is one of those questions that I see a lot of historic debate about in terms of how much stepping on the Temple Mount actually had in terms of the Second Intifada. I hear both sides. I mean, do you think if Ariel Sharon doesn't do that, is there a world in which the Second Intifada doesn't break out? It seems to me that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, but it seemed like something like an Intifada was sort of inevitable from a lot of what I've read, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I mean, obviously it's impossible to know. No one knew what was going to happen. The Oslo Accords were designed in such a way that made sense at the time. And in some places it worked. It worked in Northern Ireland, at the same model to some extent of deferring the things that are hardest to figure out until last and actually negotiate as you go. There it worked. So in a lot of ways, they thought that it might work to just defer the hardest questions till last. What some people often forget is that the Oslo process had an expiration period. It had an actual date in which the process was due to end in order to stop a situation that ended up happening, this becoming endless negotiation, an endless temporary situation. The Palestinian Authority is established in 1995 as a result of an interim agreement. It's supposed to be a temporary agreement. It expired in September 2000. It was a 5-year agreement. Technically, it expired, and all those agreements now, both sides are simply honoring them, even though they actually have no international or legal bearing. So in that sense, something was going to happen in September of 2000. Unclear what, but clearly something was going to happen. Now, a lot of the people who were part of the negotiating team, Shlomo Ben Ami, Saeb Arikat, they all said, look, we were still negotiating. Yes, negotiations broke down in July. We were still holding our meetings. There was another Taba meeting in January of 2001. They were still trying to figure out how they can save the peace process. So could it have been saved? It seems unlikely looking back. At the same time, like I've often told you, ask anyone in 1990, 1991, would it be likely that within 2 years, Israeli prime minister and the PLO chairman would be shaking hands on the White House lawn in 1993? They would have laughed in your face. So who knows? I do think that Sharon going up to Temple Mount was the catalyst, not even a major catalyst, the catalyst of the Second Intifada. Did it come at the right place in the right time? And might there have been something else that would have been the right place in the right time? Probably. But without that right then, the negotiators, at least according to their own histories, still had hope that they were going to figure out another breakthrough. So that's what I would say about that.
So just to add one thing. So it seems like, the sort of Oslo method of leaving the hardest things for the end in, both subsequent in the 2000 Camp David and the 2008, Ehud Olmert deal, from what I remember about the Ehud Olmert deal, there actually was a pretty clearly delineated plan of what might happen with Jerusalem. He was actually willing to give back, major swaths of Jerusalem, which is why, one of the reasons why it was so controversial. Have Israeli and Palestinian negotiators sort of given up on that idea of deferring the hardest questions, or what's the current state, even beyond the Temple Mount?
No, I don't think that they've given up on on figuring out the hardest questions or deferring them. I think simply what happened was the Oslo Accords from essentially 1994 until 2000 were a slow incremental process building up to final status agreement that never happened. Now, theoretically, since then, what could have happened is a complete reversal. So the situation going back to as it was prior to Oslo, in which there was no Palestinian Authority, there was no Palestinian politics, direct occupation and martial law by Israel across the entire Palestinian territories. Instead, the sides sort of froze where they were. So theoretically, any negotiations that now would happen are starting from that same place in July of 2000 where they broke down, where it's the final status. So in that sense, it's not that they're done deferring. It's just everything has continued until that point and hasn't gone back. So it's like, okay, so we still have those points to resolve. There's nothing else to resolve, so to speak. It's just quote unquote the hardest parts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is going to be the fate of Israeli settlements? What is going to be the fate of Palestinian refugees and their descendants? And what is going to be the fate of Jerusalem? Like the hardest things are the ones that are left. There's no other place to start other than that.
Got it. And it is interesting to add, 2 out of 3 of those are very practical, the refugee situation for the Palestinians and settlements. Those are both, we're talking about real people that either have real homes or, real places they want to go back to. And as you said before, the Temple Mount, probably whatever were to happen in a future 2-state solution, the Temple Mount would be open to both Jews, Muslims, and Christians to pray there. So this is really just a symbolicness of, who gets to claim, it on their, state, shekel bill or whatever, the currency would be, right? Who gets to say the Temple Mount is, one of their sites and not, an Israeli site or a Palestinian site. So it really is interesting there. Coming in for a landing, it's funny, we were talking, earlier, and you expressed some skepticism of us being able to fill a whole podcast about the Temple Mount. We could probably go for another very long time. But in the last, 20, 24 years, every time somebody wants to be provocative, it seems like on the Israeli side, generally the religious Zionist community, the Temple Mount is involved in some way, which I think, in a lot of ways lands us to what happened this past, what was it, Tuesday. Any other, is there anything you want to add there? And then we can just talk for a few minutes about, the current status of the Temple Mount and everything.
So again, the provocations with regards to Temple Mount happened from both sides. Much more of them happened from the hawkish right-wing Israeli side because it's just easier, right? Because the Israeli police often will Palestinian side. But we do also see similarly from the Waqf, we see occasional attempts at provocations. For example, raising the Hamas banner across the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Like we've seen that as part of the provocations from that side. What we see from the Israeli side very often, from the more hawkish right-wing elements. So you got stuck there for a second. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay. What we see from the hawkish right-wing elements in Israel is either symbolic attempts of rebuilding the third temple. So we see there's all kinds of movements in the temple house faithful that are trying to symbolically lay cornerstones or bring up sacrificial lambs or all kinds of things in order to show that they are treating this as the holy site of Judaism and specifically steamrolling over the sites of Islam. In addition to that, there's a lot of other things that either are symbolic, such as, for example, in 2021, what basically launched what was until then one of the biggest flare-ups from Gaza was actually started in Jerusalem, started with riots that occurred on Temple Mount that ended up with Israeli police bursting into the mosque, televised, seen as Israel is violating status quo, Jewish police officers coming into the mosque, resulting in Hamas firing rockets from Gaza, resulting in the spiral of 2021. At the same time, we also see all kinds of local initiatives of hawkish right-wing elements bringing Israeli flags up, all kinds of things that really show that both sides are looking at this symbolically. Like we said before, like I said about the embassy, it does not make Israel any stronger or better to have an Israeli flag there, nor does it make it part of Palestine to have a Hamas flag there. But these things are seen very symbolic as showing the other side, this is ours. One of the biggest events that happened in the sort of second decade of 21st century was after there was a terror attack that happened from within Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif. Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered that metal detectors be placed for all Palestinians and Muslims who come to Temple Mount have to go through metal detectors. This ended up radically blowing up in the prime minister's face because the Waqf declared a strike. It said, no, people coming to worship are not going to go through metal detectors. They're simply going to stop outside the doors of the metal detectors and pray outside. The entire world was up in arms as a result of this. The Muslim world was, Muslim countries were raising motions in the United Nations. And eventually, about 2 or 3 weeks later, Israel, without announcing anything, at 1 a.m., sent police officers to quietly take down the metal detectors and just folded as though nothing happened. That event, to me, is the most symbolic of the tensions around Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif. We saw a terror attack come from Temple Mount. We then saw the Israeli security establishment put something that I study terrorism. This would not have stopped terrorism putting metal detectors there. This was just we're going to show you now who's boss in terms of you now have to go through this. In turn, symbolically, people were seen photographed praying outside the metal detectors. The entire world up in arms. Why is the entire world up in arms over metal detectors in one area that actually don't harm anyone or do anything? They end up being taken down. It's all about the symbolism. It's all about the symbolism of who controls this, who is boss, who can call the shots here. It's all about that.
And this entire time, I mean, just to highlight this for listeners, from 1967 to today, the official position of the Israeli government is that Jews are not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. And
That's the law.
Yeah, it's a lot. And they basically have enforced it. I mean, pretty, we can talk about the last couple of weeks and, what they did or didn't do on this past Tuesday. But generally, people are surprised to hear that because, the idea that Israel would forbid Jews from praying on what is presumably the whole, what is not presumably, what is the holiest site in Judaism, right, strikes people as a little bit strange. I want to ask you one last question. This is, more philosophical or theoretical than historical. Do you believe it's possible, and I'll give some background as to why I'm asking this question, but do you believe it's possible for a Jew in 2024 to pray on the Temple Mount and it not be a big deal for, socio-political reasons? I'll just give a personal anecdote. The last time I had been up to the Temple Mount was 5 years ago. I was there taking students on a political fact-finding trip, and we were going up not as a Jewish group. We were going up actually as, a bunch of Americans. And I actually, specifically, I remember at the, suggestion of the tour guide, but it's not something I would have done 10 years ago, but it's something I did 5 years ago, to not wear my kippah and actually wear a baseball cap. And so rather than being the sort of obvious Jew, I only went to being, probably a Jew. That's a joke, but I was up there with a baseball cap, and again, our group was very obviously not Israeli. We were obviously American, and everything there. So we didn't have, obviously, if you go up, just for listeners' background that have never been to the Temple Mount, if you go up and you're clearly a group of religious-looking Jews, you're going to attract a lot more both Arab attention and also Israeli attention, right? The IDF, when I went up as part of, groups from, the religious Zionist community, you basically have, 5 IDF soldiers, right next to you watching your mouths. And the second you start to do anything that looks like praying, you'll get screamed at or worse. Here, we basically had none of that, right? Nobody thought anything of it. And I remember sitting there and I was sort of, taken aback by the moment. And, I don't remember if I prayed or wanted to pray, but I certainly felt the inspiration in some way. And again, that was completely not as a political maneuver. I think personally what, Ben-Gvir and, many of the past provocateurs are doing is, terrible. And it has nothing to do with, I think, the version of Judaism that I want to practice. And I'm not usually somebody who says the sort of, not in my name Judaism, but really it's not. I mean, the goal was not to, be provocative with prayer and, to fully prostrate and sort of mimic and mock other types of religiousness. That said, I do think in the secular world, both the secular Israeli, left, and also in the way that, say your average American might look at it, is the way that they talk about it is almost, I can't even imagine any Jew would ever want to pray there. Where from my perspective, I mean, it's obvious, right? All of our liturgy, all of our poetry, even everything, we're talking about Tisha B'Av. I mean, you're quite literally talking about this mountain. You start by reading a 6th century BCE account of the Book of Lamentations. Then you talk about, the Roman destruction. Then you talk about the importance of this place in the Crusades and everything there. So I wanted to sort of end off maybe more of like a philosophical, how might you handle that question, or how would you think about that?
So just for listeners, I'm going to repeat the question after all that, which was
Fair,
um,
fair.
do I think it's that Jews can pray on Temple Mount without it being a provocative or it being like a genuine prayer, not in the interest of politics or provocation or something like that. Um, I'll say that yes, I do think that is possible, but I would liken that to um a comment that I've given to a lot of people of where people say like, with the current atmosphere in the United States, especially on campuses, people are coming into classes, they're wearing a keffiyeh. I'm like, okay, so wearing a keffiyeh is a symbol. It's a symbol of Palestinian identity. To you, it may mean support for October 7th and support for Hamas, but that doesn't mean that's what it means to them. And even if you think for a moment that this is what they're trying to suggest, you can't assume that just because that is what they're wearing. It's a symbol that can be connected to every one of the complexities of this conflict. And very often, the mistake that people tend to make in all conflicts is they see their side as complex and the other side as simple. At their side, you can, be on the pro-Palestine side, but still disagree with October 7th and think Hamas is bad, but still think that what the IDF is doing is genocide, and still think this. It can be complicated. Whereas the other side, no, if you're pro-Israel, so that means that you hate Palestinians and you're against that, and obviously vice versa from the other side. Like the other side is always simple. Our side is complex. So similarly, obviously our side is complex in the sense that if our side, if what you're asking about, you being on Temple Mount there, can you do this without being provocative? Yes, I think that it can be a genuine thing on a personal level. I think the politics around it make it much more complicated. On a personal level, it can be non-provocative in the same way as wearing a keffiyeh or even wearing a pro-Palestine symbol does not necessarily mean that you are pro-October 7th or even pro-Hamas. You may hate Hamas, just like people could be pro-Israel and against the government. So yes, I do think that is possible. I also understand people who don't get it. I also understand people who would say, yes, but in the current context, that's clearly what you're trying to do. I don't think it's true. I think a lot of people want to either feel religiously or culturally or simply politically identify with a certain side, but that doesn't mean that they agree with everything that side does or think that it's against the other side. So
Yeah, yeah.
that
No,
would be my
I
answer.
appreciate that. And I would equate it, quite frankly, to when people on the Israeli right say, this isn't actually an Islamic holy site. I mean, it's in both cases, it's, you know, to some extent, I think this conflict will only be solved once there's some ability to not just have political connection, but actually some sort of religious connection. I mean, that sort of seems obvious. The politics are almost easy, meaning I think, you could probably sit down, right? The political issues, assuming there's goodwill, right? I think questions of settlements and right of return slash, giving some sort of, payment, for right of return, those strike me as a lot easier things to figure out than the Temple Mount.
I'm laughing because you are giving a living example of what I just said, right? If we take you as the more religious side and me as a more political side, as a political scientist, the political side is easy for you. It's simple. Whereas the religious side is complex. And I'm saying, like, you're the epitome
No,
of
no, no. Come on.
oh,
You
the
were
political.
saying it. You were saying it in terms of, an entire class of people. I don't think political scientists are simple, but I just think,
I think the politics are simple. I'm saying you think the politics can be resolved, but the religion is maybe more complex. I'm saying whatever. It's
no, but yeah, yes or no. Meaning, I think what's confused every American president that has tried to work on this is they've come up with like relatively reasonable plans that they've then put forth to the hardliners on both sides rejecting it. And from a bird's eye perspective, if you don't understand the religious element of this that we sort of opened up with, you're shocked and said, hey, but this was a good map, right? It made it doesn't make sense for Gush Etzion to be given to a future Palestinian state. There are hundreds of thousands of Jews there. And so just land swap and, okay, everybody will be a little bit unhappy and you'll end up with a really funky map. But then you get back to, the religious issues, and for some religious Zionists, the settlements are a religious issue. That's a whole other question there. So that's all I was saying.
I stand by my statement. All of a sudden, from one side, it's easier complicated. I say that both the religious and the political. I'd say you just have to understand both, and you have to understand that for some people, especially when you call it religious Zionism, some people the politics become that you can possibly ever consider compromising because you can't compromise something that is ordained to you by God. And in that sense, it doesn't have to be necessarily Temple Mount. It can also be Gush Etzion. It can also be anything, but it doesn't have to be because you're religious. For a lot of hardliners, right? I think about from Menachem Begin, and it was Yasser Arafat, who was not a religious figure, who also walked away from Oslo. Like in a lot of times, it's not only because of your religious devotion; it could be for your political devotion that you assume that position. So I think both of them have to be taken into consideration. I think where often presidents of the United States have failed is simply in the fact that you said, assuming there's goodwill on both sides. At the end of the day, the president can only be there to try to mitigate both sides. If they don't want to come together, it doesn't matter how good a map you present. Like it's just
Got it.
like if the sides aren't ready, it's not going to happen.
So we'll just have to wait until there is a peace treaty that's finally cemented, and we'll see which was the easier side to figure out.
We'll get back to you on the next podcast.
Yes, Alon, thank you as always.
Thank you. I just want to mention for anyone who's tuned into this on my YouTube channel, I was talking with Rabbi Daniel Levine, J Life with Daniel. Highly recommend his podcast. And I'm going to say also for anyone who's tuned in through Daniel,
Please.
I have a YouTube channel which I upload news briefings almost every day about the Israel-Hamas war. It's Alon Burstein, and we'll see you next time.
I just assume that anybody that's a consistent listener of my podcast has already subscribed to everything you do, given that this is your 7th or 8th time here. But in case you haven't, go check out Alon Burstein. Alon, thank you again.
Good to see you.